Imagine a state run by paranoid gym rats who banned money and washed newborns in industrial-strength wine. Ancient Sparta wasn't just a war machine. It was a dystopian nightmare where theft was legal, beards were mandatory, and ordering a salad could get you exiled. We are stripping away the Hollywood propaganda to reveal 33 chaotic, dumb, and terrifying facts about history's most toxic fraternity. You are not ready for how weird this gets. 1. Wine baths for newborns. While modern parents panic about water temperature and organic soap, Spartan mothers were out there marinating their infants in undiluted stinging wine. This was not a weird spa treatment. It was a brutal biological filter designed to weed out the weak from day one. The Spartans held a pseudo-scientific belief that a sickly or epileptic child would react violently to the strong alcohol, potentially convulsing or even dying on the spot, while a future warrior would take it like a champ. It was essentially a chemical toughness test administered minutes after birth. If the baby screamed too much or fainted from the shock, they were considered defective goods. Only those who could handle a wine bath without losing their cool were deemed worthy enough to be shown to the elders for the next round of inspection. 2. Fat shaming. In the modern world, we have body positivity, but in ancient Sparta, having a dad bod was literally a state crime punishable by public humiliation. The government enforced terrifyingly strict physical standards, and the city officials known as effers would conduct mandatory inspections every 10 days. Citizens had to strip completely naked in public so these officials could examine their bodies for any sign of flabbiness. If you looked a little too soft or had enjoyed one too many extra rations, you were not just fined. You were ridiculed by the entire community and potentially stripped of your rights. They viewed excess fat as a sign of laziness and a lack of discipline, creating a toxic environment where missing a workout could literally cost you your social standing and your bank account. 3. The wedding night drag. This is hands down one of the most psychologically bizarre rituals in history. Because Spartan men lived in barracks and spent their entire youth exclusively with other boys, they were often awkward or completely terrified of intimate contact with women. To make the transition to heterosexual marriage less traumatic for the groom, the bride had to shave her head completely bald and dress up in men's sandals and a cloak on her wedding night. She would lay in the dark, looking as much like one of his army buddies as possible. The idea was to trick the groom's brain into feeling comfortable enough to perform his duties by pretending his new wife was just another guy from the platoon. It was a strange, state-sponsored roleplay designed to bridge the gap between their homosocial military life and the duty of procreation. 4. Missed the Battle of Marathon. Imagine being the most feared military force on Earth and missing the most important battle of the century because you were waiting for the moon to look right. When the Athenians sent the runner Phidippides to beg for help against the massive invading Persian army, the Spartans essentially checked their calendar and said no. They were in the middle of the Carnea religious festival, and their laws strictly forbade military marches until the full moon appeared. While Athens was fighting for the survival of Western civilization against overwhelming odds, the Spartan army was sitting at home partying and looking at the sky. They finally showed up a day late, marched to the battlefield, looked at the thousands of dead Persians, said nice job to the Athenians, and awkwardly walked back home. 5. Iron money. While the rest of the civilized world was trading with gold and silver coins, Sparta decided to make their currency as annoying and useless as possible to prevent greed. Their legendary lawgiver Lycurgus banned precious metals and introduced heavy iron bars called pellinors as the only legal tender. To make matters worse, they soaked the hot iron in vinegar to make it brittle, ensuring it could never be resmelted into weapons or tools. If you wanted to buy something expensive, you would need a literal cart pulled by oxen just to transport your wallet. This successfully destroyed their economy and stopped foreign trade because nobody wanted to sell luxury goods in exchange for a pile of rusty, heavy scrap metal that you could not even carry in your pocket. 6. Sneaking out for sex. Spartan couples were the original long-distance relationship, even though they lived in the same city. After getting married, a Spartan man was not allowed to live with his wife. He had to stay in the barracks with the boys until he was 30 years old. If he wanted to see his wife, he had to sneak out of the mess hall at night, creep into her house, and sneak back before the sun came up. If he was caught, he would be beaten for being absent. Lycurgus designed this system to keep the sexual tension at an absolute maximum, believing that tired, bored couples produced weak children, while couples who only had vigorous, secret encounters would produce energetic warriors. Some men literally fathered multiple children before they ever saw their own wives' faces in the daylight. 7. Anti-intellectuals. Sparta was the only major Greek city that contributed absolutely zero to the world of philosophy, astronomy, or theater. While Athens was busy inventing democracy, sculpting masterpieces, and writing plays that we still read today, Sparta viewed high-level thinking as a dangerous distraction from warfare. They prided themselves on being uneducated in the arts because they believed rhetoric and complex thoughts made men soft and hesitant. If you were a Spartan who liked to sit around debating the meaning of life, you were considered a useless weirdo. Their entire educational system was designed to produce obedient, robotic soldiers, not thinkers, effectively making them the historical equivalent of that one guy at the gym who thinks reading books is for losers and only cares about his bench press. 8. Hereditary cooks. In Sparta, you could not just follow your dreams and open a restaurant if you had a talent for flavor. Professions like cooking, baking, and flute playing were part of a strict hereditary caste system. This means if your father was a cook, you were legally required to be a cook, regardless of whether you had any talent for it. If your dad was terrible at boiling pork, guess what? You were going to be terrible at boiling pork too, and the whole mess hall had to suffer your bad cooking for another generation. This complete lack of meritocracy in the kitchen might explain why the rest of Greece constantly made fun of the infamous Spartan black broth. You were stuck in the family business forever, even if that business was making food that tasted like misery and vinegar. 9. Authorized theft. The Spartan education system, the Agoga, was basically a state-sponsored Hunger Games where child abuse was the curriculum. The boys were intentionally underfed to the point of starvation to force them to steal food just to survive. This was not cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It was a practical exam in stealth and resourcefulness. The state wanted soldiers who could forage and scavenge behind enemy lines without getting caught. However, the rules were twisted. If a boy was caught stealing a loaf of bread, he was whipped mercilessly, not because he stole the bread, but because he was a bad thief who got caught. The lesson was never stealing is wrong. The lesson was getting caught is embarrassing, creating a generation of kleptomaniacs who were terrifyingly good at being silent. 10. Perfume ban. While the rest of the ancient Mediterranean was obsessed with smelling like exotic flowers and expensive oils, Sparta legally banned the sale and use of perfumes. They believed that scents and unguents were an unnecessary luxury that made men soft and womanly. In their eyes, a true Spartan warrior should smell of only two things: high-quality olive oil and the honest sweat of training. The city likely smelled exactly like a high school locker room that had not been cleaned in a century. This ban was so strict that perfumers were expelled from the territory because they were seen as peddlers of deception who masked the natural, masculine scent of a hard day's work with artificial lies. 11. Kidnapping your wife. Romance in Sparta did not involve poetry or long walks on the beach. It involved a ritualized felony. Marriage was not officially recognized until the groom performed a ceremonial abduction of the bride. Even if the marriage was arranged by the parents and everyone knew it was happening, the groom still had to physically seize his wife and carry her off as if he were stealing her during a raid. This ritual was meant to symbolize that a Spartan man took what he wanted by force, rather than receiving it as a gift. It also served to minimize the emotional attachment, framing the union as a capture rather than a partnership. The bride was not given away, she was taken, reinforcing the aggressive, predatory nature of Spartan life even in their most intimate moments. 12. Black broth. The culinary reputation of Sparta was so bad that people joked it explained their willingness to die. Their staple dish was a nightmare soup called melasomos, which consisted of pork legs boiled in blood, salt, and vinegar. The vinegar was essential because it kept the blood from clotting during the cooking process, resulting in a dark, foul-tasting sludge. When a visitor from another Greek city finally tasted this legendary soup, he famously spat it out and declared, "Now I understand why the Spartans do not fear death." They ate this not because they lacked taste buds, but because they believed rich, delicious food made men physically soft and mentally weak. It was dietary masochism designed to fuel a war machine. 13. Mustaches were illegal. In a society where hair was a massive symbol of status, the Spartan leadership found a way to micromanage facial hair to prove a point. While full, bushy beards were mandatory for adult men as a sign of virility, the Ephors passed a specific, bizarre decree requiring all men to shave their mustaches to obey the laws. This resulted in a distinctive, slightly goofy look, a full beard with a bare upper lip. Historians believe this law existed solely to demonstrate the state's absolute control over the individual. By forcing the most fearsome warriors in Greece to shave a random strip of hair on their face, the government reminded them daily that even their own bodies belonged to the state, down to the last follicle. 14. Voting by shouting. The Spartan version of democracy was less like a parliament and more like a chaotic game show. When they needed to elect members to the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, they did not use ballots or show of hands. Instead, the candidates would walk in front of the assembly one by one, and the crowd would scream their approval. Judges sat in a nearby building where they could not see the candidates, only hear the noise. They simply selected the winner based on who received the loudest, most deafening roar from the mob. This shout-o-meter method was mocked by Aristotle as childish, but the Spartans loved it because it added a visceral, physical element to politics. If you had a sore throat, your vote literally did not count. 15. Buried. Next door. Most ancient Greek cities were terrified of miasma, or death pollution, and insisted on burying their dead far outside the city walls to keep the ghosts away. The Spartans, being practical sociopaths, did the exact opposite. The legendary lawgiver Lycurgus ordered that the dead be buried right inside the city, often in plots between houses or near temples. The goal was psychological conditioning. He wanted children to grow up playing tag around tombstones so they would become completely desensitized to the sight of graves and corpses. By living with the dead, Spartans learned not to fear ghosts or the afterlife, treating death as just another mundane part of the neighborhood scenery rather than a spooky supernatural event. 16. Comb. Before combat. Before the Battle of Thermopylae, a Persian spy was sent to scout the Spartan camp, expecting to see them sharpening swords or building fortifications. Instead, he ran back to King Xerxes and reported that the Spartans were sitting around combing their long hair and oiling their bodies. Xerxes laughed, thinking they were vain idiots preparing for a beauty pageant. He was dead wrong. A Spartan exile explained that this grooming ritual was actually a terrifying sign. Spartans only meticulously groomed their hair when they were preparing to face inevitable death. It was a ritual of acceptance and composure. They were making sure they would make a beautiful corpse, signaling to the enemy that they had no intention of leaving the battlefield alive. 17. Banning rhetoric. The Spartans absolutely hated long speeches, flowery poetry, and the kind of intellectual yapping that the Athenians loved. They valued brevity so much that the region they lived in, Laconia, gave us the English word laconic, which describes a person of few words. Their education system trained boys to speak only when necessary, and to deliver their thoughts in sharp, cutting one-liners that acted like verbal spears. The most famous example of this happened when Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, sent a terrifying threat to Sparta saying, "If I invade Laconia, I shall turn you out." The Spartans simply wrote back a single word, "if." They were the historical masters of the mic drop, viewing extensive talking as a sign of insecurity and a waste of valuable time that could be spent sharpening a spear. 18. drunk slaves. As lessons, in a twisted version of a modern scared straight program, Spartan elders would force their slaves, the helots, to drink massive amounts of unmixed wine until they were blackout drunk. They would then drag these stumbling, vomiting, and incoherent men into the mess halls during dinner to perform for the young Spartan trainees. The goal was not entertainment. It was a visceral, disgusting demonstration of what happens when a man loses control of his faculties. By watching a human being reduced to a slobbering mess, the Spartan boys were taught to associate alcohol excess with shame, weakness, and the slave class. It was a brutal psychological tool to ensure that the future defenders of the state would never let their guard down or embarrass themselves with a hangover. 19. Xenolagia, the Purge. While Athens was a cosmopolitan hub that welcomed traders and thinkers, Sparta operated like a paranoid gated community on steroids. They practiced something called xenolagia, which was the periodic, state-sanctioned expulsion of all foreigners. The government was terrified that outsiders would bring in corrupting influences like new philosophies, luxury goods, or softness that would erode the Spartan way of life. They viewed foreign ideas as a virus that could infect their perfect military machine. If you were a traveler just passing through to sell some nice rugs or teach a new song, you would be aggressively escorted to the border and told never to return. It was a cultural firewall designed to keep Sparta frozen in time, completely isolated from the changing world around them. 20. Women owned everything. In a twist that shocked the rest of the ancient world, the most hyper-masculine society in history was economically dominated by women. Because Spartan men were constantly away on campaigns, living in barracks, or dying young in battle, the women were left to manage the estates and the finances. Over time, through inheritance and dowries, Spartan women came to own approximately 40% of all the agricultural land in Sparta. Philosophers like Aristotle actually complained about this, calling it a gynocracy, or rule by women, and blamed their influence for Sparta's eventual decline. While Athenian women were treated like furniture and locked indoors, Spartan women were the wealthy CEOs running the show, racing chariots, and telling their husbands what to do. 21. No written laws. In any normal civilization, laws are written down so everyone knows the rules, but Sparta was far from normal. Their semi-mythical founder, Lycurgus, specifically forbade the writing of laws, known as rhetorics. He believed that if laws were written, people would just look for loopholes, but if they were memorized and culturally ingrained, people would follow the spirit of the law. This meant that the judges, who were old men from the Gerousia, could essentially interpret the law however they felt like on any given day. It created a system based entirely on tradition and the arbitrary decisions of the elderly elite. You could not call your lawyer to check the statute. You just had to hope the judge liked your family and was in a good mood. 22. Only 2 names on tombstones. The Spartans were incredibly stingy with participation trophies, even in death. The state strictly forbade placing a name on a grave marker for almost everyone. You could live to be 90, be a good citizen, and pay your taxes, but you would still be buried under a blank rock. There were only 2 exceptions to this rule, highlighting the only 2 things the state actually cared about. A man could get his name on a tombstone if he died in battle, and a woman could get hers if she died in childbirth. The Spartans viewed childbirth as the female equivalent of warfare, a life-threatening struggle to produce new assets for the state. If you didn't die giving your life for Sparta's future, the state decided you simply didn't deserve to be remembered. 23. No trade or farming. Being a full citizen, or Spartiate, came with a very strange restriction. You were legally forbidden from having a job. Manual labor, farming, and commerce were considered beneath the dignity of a warrior and were strictly left to the lower classes, the perioikoi, free non-citizens, and the helots, slaves. A Spartan citizen was a professional gentleman of leisure, whose only work was physical training, hunting, and war. They were banned from handling money or engaging in business deals because the state feared that the pursuit of profit would distract them from the pursuit of glory. It was the only society in history where being productive in the economy was illegal, and the entire ruling class was essentially a group of unemployed bodybuilders supported by slave labor. 24. The Tremblers. If you were a Spartan soldier and you fled from battle, you were not executed or exiled. You suffered a fate considered far worse. You became a trisons, or a trembler. This was a special social class of cowards who were forced to live in Sparta as walking examples of shame. They had to shave half their beard and keep the other half long, creating a ridiculous, lopsided look so everyone knew who they were from a distance. They were legally required to give up their seat to younger men, no one would speak to them or marry their daughters, and any citizen could strike them in the street without consequence. They were ghosts haunting their own lives, forced to endure decades of daily psychological torture to show others the high cost of cowardice. 25. The Fox Story. Nothing captures the absolute insanity of the Spartan mindset better than the famous legend of the boy and the fox. As part of their survival training, a young Spartan boy stole a fox, intending to eat it. When he was confronted by his instructors, he hid the live animal under his cloak to avoid detection. The panicked fox began to panic and literally gnawed through the boy's stomach and ripped out his intestines. In any other society, the child would scream, drop the fox, and go to the hospital. But this kid stood perfectly still, maintaining a poker face while being disemboweled from the inside out, and eventually dropped dead without making a sound. The story was taught to generations of Spartans not as a warning, but as an example of perfect discipline. It is better to die in agony than to be caught doing something poorly. 26. The Red Cloak. The iconic crimson cloak of the Spartan warrior, known as the phonikes, was not just a fashion statement. It was a calculated piece of psychological warfare and practical laundry advice rolled into one. The Spartans wore red primarily so that if they were wounded in battle, the blood would not show against the fabric. This prevented the enemy from seeing their weakness and gaining confidence, maintaining the illusion that the Spartan line was an invincible wall of immortals who simply did not bleed. Conversely, the bright red color was meant to terrify opponents, signaling instantly that the professionals had arrived. It was the ancient equivalent of a hazard sign, telling everyone else on the battlefield that the people wearing this color were there strictly to ruin your day. 27. Senior Citizen. Leonidas. Pop culture and Hollywood movies like 300 depict King Leonidas as a rugged, middle-aged bodybuilder in the prime of his life, probably in his 30s or 40s. In reality, when Leonidas marched to the hot gates at Thermopylae to face the Persian Empire, he was likely around 60 years old. In the ancient world, where life expectancy was often short, he was essentially a senior citizen eligible for a pension. But in Sparta, you were not considered too old for war until you were physically unable to hold a shield. The fact that a grandfather led the most famous suicide mission in history makes the story even more hardcore. He wasn't a young hothead seeking glory. He was a hardened veteran who